So I've had the Canon R5 for almost 2 months and it absolutely is an amazing camera. But is it perfect? Let's talk about it. What's up YouTube? Anthony here. I want to talk about the R5. I have had the pleasure of being able to shoot this camera for the past 2 months and it absolutely is an amazing camera. But after having it, I really want to dive into what my user experience has been like. Now, a couple of months ago, I did a video on the R5 comparing it to the R, and I'll drop a link to that video down in the description. Now, this video, I'm not going to compare the two because I've already done that and I think that's redundant. What I really want to focus on is, as a portrait photographer, my experience with the camera. How has it been to use the camera, to work with the camera, to edit the files, those sorts of things. That's what I want to touch on in this video. So if you're not a portrait photographer or someone that shoots people, this video may not be overly useful for you, but stick around, it may. So as the same as I did with my previous video, I have the chapters down below. So if you want to jump to a specific section, by all means do that. I'm going to try to keep this video a little bit quicker and a little bit more concise, so that way we could just get through it really quick. So with that being said, let's just jump right in. So the first thing I want to touch on is something that I talked about in that previous video, and it had to do with the exposure. When I was comparing the R5 to the R, I was noticing that there was a 2/3 stop difference in exposure between the R5. The R5 was darker than the R at the same exact settings. And I'm happy to report that that ultimately was a cause from the Adobe D&G converter. Once Lightroom was updated and it was able to natively support the R5 files, I did some testing and I found that those native files matched the exposure pretty much to the T with the EOS R. So it really did seem to be a D&G converter, and you know, that makes sense. That converter was beta and they kind of just threw something together to basically be able to convert these files. So they're always having to reverse engineer things. So that definitely makes sense. Being on the topic of Lightroom, I want to jump into the first thing about using this camera and the experience that I've had. Unfortunately, although Lightroom supports the raw files natively, they don't yet have the camera profiles for this particular camera. And, you know, for a long time, I didn't really think that it made much of a difference. I have heard about camera specific profiles in Lightroom for some time, but for a really long time, I just used the Adobe profiles because, you know, I just didn't think that it really made a difference. And a couple of years ago, I decided to jump into it because so many photographers were talking about it that, you know, I was like, I want to see about it for myself. So I decided to look into it, and I have to say it really does make a difference. And that is really, really noticeable in Lightroom with the R5 files. I'm going to put a side by side on the screen so that you can see the difference between the Adobe portrait and the camera profile portrait. There really is a difference. If you look at the skin tone, the Adobe color really adds a green cast to the skin tone and to the image overall. And to be quite frank, it's just not that pleasing. You know, when you hear about people saying they love Canon because they love the Canon colors, you don't get that with the Adobe profiles, unfortunately. And so you can do some work to try to get the Adobe color to match the Canon. But you know, it is a bit of a challenge, and I have really struggled to be able to get those colors to match the colors that should be coming out of the camera. And that's a really big disappointment because you know, we don't know at what point Adobe is going to put those profiles in, if they put them in at all. From my understanding, the 1DX profiles are not there, and I think the EOS RP profiles are not there. So there's no guarantee that they're even going to put those profiles in. So that's unfortunate. Now, of course, you can use the Canon software to be able to edit your files, but if you've ever used DPP, you know that that is just not really a viable tool to use for professionals anyway, that has to edit photos in any type of quantity. So it really isn't really isn't an option. So it is unfortunate that Lightroom doesn't support those color profiles. So if you're thinking about picking up the R5, or if you have it, just know that you are going to have to combat with that and figure out a way to, you know, come up with the process flow to be able to get those colors to, you know, be what you're looking for. So it's unfortunate, but I'll live with it. Okay, up next, we're going to body and ergonomics. And, you know, as I said in my previous video, the camera absolutely feels great in the hand. You know, it is a little bit smaller than a DSLR, of course, but, you know, with the grip, it fits in my hand very well. It's very well balanced. Even when I have a heavy lens on there, it just feels good in the hand. So ergonomically, Canon cameras are fantastic. I've been a Canon shooter for a long time. The ergonomics on their cameras are great. That being said, there are some things that I have found that are not quite the most ideal. Now, while I was very glad that they brought the joystick back, you know, I have been using the touch bar on the R, and I really see why people hated it. I didn't use it at first, and I've been using it lately. I can see why people didn't like it. So I'm glad that they brought the joystick back. But what I've found to be not that great is the placement of the joystick. I really wish that the joystick would have been more where the info button is at and not so much where they placed it, where the touch bar was. When you're using the camera, it really is a stretch to get your thumb up far enough to be able to comfortably use the joystick. Now, I have longer fingers, so I can make my way up there and it's not too much of a problem. But if you have smaller hands, I really could see where it could be a little cumbersome and somewhat difficult to really be able to get your thumb up that far to use the joystick. On most of Canon's DSLRs, that joystick is lower, roughly around where the info button is. So it feels more natural when you're using the scroll wheel. It's just very natural to just move up just a little bit to be able to get to that joystick. So to have to go all the way up to the top to get that, you know, you get used to it, but it never quite feels comfortable and intuitive. It always feels like, you know, you're really reaching somewhere where it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm sure after time I will get more used to it, but I definitely have to say the placement of it isn't the best. It isn't great, but at least we have the joystick back. So that's cool. Speaking of the scroll wheel, I have to say I rather would have preferred to have a directional pad. I know we have the joystick that you could basically use for a directional pad, but I've come to really enjoy using the directional pad on the R, and I kind of wish that we would have had it on this. Now, I know probably with some of the other DSLRs, I can't think off the top of my head. I think they are scroll wheels when they have the joystick, but it would have been nice to have the joystick and have the directional pad. Sometimes when I'm going through the menus, I don't want to reach all the way up to the joystick, but I don't want to sit there and scroll around with the wheel to get there also. It would have been nice just to have a directional pad where I could have just did whatever and move on from there. So those are minor things. It's not going to be something that's going to make the camera not fun or, you know, able to be used. Other than that, ergonomically, the body, fantastic. Moving on to the EVF, as a portrait shooter, and for me, what I could say is I don't really use the EVF that much. Now, you know, I know this can vary depending upon your style and photographer and their choices, but when I got the R, the one thing that I really loved about shooting with the mirrorless camera was that I was able to remove the camera from being in front of my face and I was able to hold it out. I like to do that because it allows me to connect better with my subject, okay? If I'm shooting and if the whole time I have a camera up like this, there's something in between my face and the subject. So in terms of really connecting with them, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do that. But when I'm able to just have the camera like this and I can just hold the camera out like this and get those shots, I can still make eye contact with the subject. The subject's able to see my face. We're able to connect. And what I have found is I'm just able to get better emotion out of my subject in doing that. So I don't really use the EVF that much. Now I will say, and this is common with just about any LCD, if you're in bright daylight, the LCD can be difficult to see even with the brightness turned all the way up. That is not a knock on the R5. That's just the nature of LCDs. They can only be so bright and they just don't really work when there's a lot of light. So if I'm in a situation where there's a lot of light, I can't really see the LCD, maybe I'm trying to check focus, something like that, then I will use the EVF. But other than that, I really don't use it that much. I just use the back of the screen and I just roll with it that way. So EVF is fantastic, but for me, don't really use it. The shutter lag that was in the R, it has been removed from the R5. There really isn't a shutter lag at all. But what I will say is there is a slight delay in you seeing the image. So if you're tracking something really fast, you will notice that unlike an optical viewfinder where what you see in the viewfinder is what is going on in front of you, with the R5, there is a slight delay. So what you see is milliseconds slower than what's going on in real life. Now, as a portrait photographer, this is obviously no problem for me whatsoever because I'm not shooting anything that's moving really fast. But if you are into, say, birding or, auto racing or something of that sort where there's a really fast moving subject, I think it will take some getting used to kind of understand the lag difference so that you can make sure that you're sticking with it the way you need to. But in my opinion, again, coming from a portrait shooter, it's a non-issue. It's nothing that I would worry about, but I just thought that I would mention it because it is something that I had noticed and kind of did some testing on. I did end up picking up a SanDisk 128 gig CF Express card. I hadn't had that yet when I did my original review video. So I went ahead and picked that up. And then I have a 32 gig card, SD card in there. And so the way that I typically do my shoots is I record everything to that one CF Express card, but then I got the 32 gig card. So then that way that is my backup card and I can swap those out every so often. So that way I don't have all of my photos from any given session or wedding or whatever, all stored on, just two cards. So the CF Express, it all goes on there because that's relatively secure media. And then the SD, I at least know that if an SD card fails or if it goes corrupt, whatever the case, I've only lost a certain amount of my backup. So it's kind of a redundancy thing that works well for me. In terms of file writing to the card and buffer, to be frank, I really haven't done a lot of testing with that because it's not my style to shoot high speed. Even regardless of how big these files are, I've never really been one that have shot 20, 30, 40, 50 frames from the same moment. I just think that that's a waste. And when I get home and I put them on the computer, I don't want to have to go through 2,000 photos for a portrait session. That's just insane to me. So I don't shoot that way. So I really haven't tested, buffer size and how many photos you can get and that sort of thing. But what I can say from my experience in shooting with this camera is that I've never had a problem with the buffer. At no point have I had to wait for this camera to catch up so that I can continue shooting. And I've done multiple shoots and multiple testing with the camera, and I've never had any problems with the buffer. So if you're just a typical portrait shooter, I don't think that you would ever encounter any buffering issues, provided that you have a fast enough card in. And if you have a CF Express card and you're shooting mechanical shutter, you probably would never really have to worry about the buffer. So battery life, obviously the R5 is not going to be as good with battery as the R. Okay. And I've watched a lot of other videos and people touch on that and they seem disappointed about it, or they mention it as a con to the R5. I don't really see it as being a con because the two cameras are not comparable. You obviously have more tech in the R5. You have IBIS for one. You have a Digic 10 processor that's doing a lot more processing for your autofocus. So you really can't expect for the battery life to be equal to a camera that doesn't have that. So is the battery life in the R5 less reduced than the R? Absolutely. I've not really done a lot of tests to see how fast it drains because to me, I'm not concerned about battery life. I have a ton of LPE6 batteries. I'm not concerned if I have to swap out a battery. To me, it's not a big deal. It's not something that I have to worry about. I don't need to get through an entire day on one battery. Would that be nice? Sure, I suppose. But when I'm changing out batteries, is it ever a problem? Absolutely not. I keep batteries on me. It's nothing for me to take a battery out, swap a new battery in. It takes all of 5 or 10 seconds. So the battery life for me is not something that I'm concerned about, especially as a portrait shooter. I don't really shoot weddings. I do a lot more different types of portrait things. It's never really been a problem. So if that's a concern for you, I would definitely say, yes, you're going to go through more batteries with the R5 than you would the R. But if you have a bunch of batteries and you have to swap them out, considering the tech that they put in the camera, I would take reduced battery life over having the IBIS and having the amazing autofocus any day of the week. So it is reduced. You are going to have to change batteries sooner. Even with the grip, I have noticed that the batteries die quicker than they do on my R. But to me, it's not been a problem. It's nothing that I've been concerned about. Nothing to worry about. Autofocus performance has been fantastic, and I'm going to jump on the computer real quick and I'm going to go through some things, and I want to give you some stats on the autofocus. Now, before I do that, let me just be real with you. The autofocus is great, but it is not perfect. Okay. I want to set the expectation. I know a lot of people, when they do these videos, you know, they're just like, the autofocus is, it's the best ever, and it rivals Sony, this, that, and the other. It is fantastic, and it is definitely better than the R. I was just using the R a few times last week, and I missed using my R5. There is a noticeable difference between the R5 autofocus and the R autofocus. It is so much more improved, no doubt about it. But that being said, any autofocus is going to have its limitations, and the R5 is no exception. There are times where it doesn't perform that great. There are situations, there are conditions that are not conducive to having the autofocus perform phenomenally, okay? So the ones that nailed it, those are tack sharp. The focus was spot on, perfect. Then the next category is going to be usable. And my definition of usable is the shots are pretty much in focus, but they're not tack sharp, okay? So they're not soft, they're not out of focus, but they're not tack sharp, so they're 100% usable. I would have no problem whatsoever delivering them to a client, wouldn't think twice about it. They're absolutely usable. And then the autofocus is the autofocus, and those are either it was slightly soft or it was completely out of focus, one of the two. So even if it was like usable, but just a little too soft, I erred on putting that in the autofocus column, okay? So out of all those 15, I took 378 shots. Of those 378 shots, 239 were nailed, 88 were usable, and 51 was out of focus. So that ended up being nailed 63%, and usable was 23%, and out of focus was 13%. So out of almost 400%, only having 13% out of focus, in my opinion, is a great number. Again, you cannot expect the autofocus in any camera to just be perfect every single time, every situation, any conditions. That's just not practical. So to know that I could use this camera and basically get 85 to 90% of my shots either tack sharp or very usable is fantastic to me. The autofocus on this is great. I don't even have to really focus on the LCD. And that's what's so great about the autofocus. And I know I'm spending a lot of time here, but I think the autofocus is one of the best things about this camera, and one of the things that really makes this camera worth the money. When I know that I can just hold the camera out there, and again, going back to being able to connect to my subject, when I can just look at my subject and direct my subject and connect and just hold the camera there and know that that focus is going to catch and it's going to be spot on and those images are going to be tack sharp. As a portrait photographer, that is invaluable to me, because now it allows me to focus more on being present with my client versus worrying about trying to get my pictures tack sharp. And when I can get 85 to 90% of those images to be sharp, then I know when I come back and I'm on the computer, I have a lot of images that I can go through and I can select the best of the best of the best. And that is something that you really just can't put a price on when you shoot people. It's fantastic. The autofocus on this camera is as good as what people says, with the caveat that it's not perfect. I want to stress that it is not perfect. To really get the best results, you need good conditions. You need good lighting. If there wasn't movement, again, it will catch focus very well in low light. It does. It focuses really well in low light. But when you have low light and you compare that with movement, it does struggle a little bit. So just know that when you're in that situation, eye autofocus, face detect, it isn't perfect. It may not work great. But all in all, the autofocus is absolutely fantastic. After 2 months of using this camera, I still feel the same as I felt 2 months ago. Okay, in terms of image quality, I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm sure you've seen other videos, you've seen things. The image quality out of this camera is fantastic. Now, I don't think that it's light years better in front of the R. I mentioned that in that video, and I still feel the same today. I think the R is a great camera, and I think the sensor in the R5 is great. but I don't think it's blowing away the R, and mainly it's because the R wasn't a bad camera. I think the image quality in that camera was really good, and so the R5, it takes that and it takes it a bit of a step forward, but you know, it's not light years ahead, but the image quality is great. The thing that I have enjoyed the most about using the R5 is the megapixels and the ability to be able to crop in and still have a lot of resolution. That has been great. You know, typically when I'm shooting, I sometimes will crop in camera. Sometimes if I'm not exactly sure what I want the final outcome to be, I'll shoot wider and then I'll crop in post. I've never had any problems doing this with any of the cameras that I've ever owned. And I've never owned a camera that was as high as 45 megapixels, and I've never had an issue. So it's really been nice to be able to take a 45 megapixel file, crop it down, and still have a 30 megapixel image. That's just fantastic. And that's really what you're getting the megapixels for. You're not going to see this huge shift in image quality if you're coming from a camera like the EOS R that already had 30 megapixels and already had great image quality. You're not going to see this huge leap forward, but you will see the ability to be able to crop without hesitation. Having that 45 megapixels, I will shoot wide without even having to think twice about it, because I know that I can come home, can put those images on the computer, and I can crop to my heart's content, and I'm still going to be able to deliver a high megapixel image to my client or for whatever I need it for, whether that's print or whatever. That's where the 45 megapixels really comes into play, and that has not let me down. I have enjoyed that. I have used that. Image quality is perfect, so it's been great. Okay, moving on to dynamic range. Now, dynamic range was something that I wanted to do more testing on from my comparison video, because at that time, I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to test the dynamic range, and when I did that video, I didn't really have time to get out to do the testing. I was using it. I was trying to get the video done. So I've had obviously more time to play around with it, more time to really look at the dynamic range. And I'm going to jump in. I'm going to show you some stuff. But before I do that, I want to say I do think the dynamic range has been improved over the EOS R. But to be frank, and again, I've been a Canon shooter for a very long time. I've only shot with Canon, but I will still say I don't think the dynamic range is quite on par with Sony when it comes to highlight recovery. Now, when we get into shadow recovery, I think the R5 performs really, really well, and I think it rivals Sony in terms of shadow recovery. But when it comes to highlight recovery, so when you look at dynamic range as a whole, I think on the highlight side, the R5 is not great. I think it's very consistent with Canon in terms of where it falls with the highlight recovery. But all in all, I think there is some improvement in dynamic range over the R. So let's jump in and let's look at some stuff here. So let's start with this image here. So I'm basically just going to kind of do just some adjustments just to show you what we could do. So I'll play with a couple of different things. So obviously this image is very much underexposed. So if I come in and we just up that exposure 3 stops, as you can see, we get quite some good shadow recovery. There's obviously going to be some noise because I'm bringing it up 3 stops, but as you can see, the noise is really not bad. I think this image is still very usable. And if you were shooting underexposed by accident, or if you were trying to save your highlights here, you know, I think this is still an extremely usable file. And if you want to push it a little bit more and bring the shadows up and bring the blacks up, I mean, you can really see that the shadow recovery is really good. I am impressed with the shadow recovery. Again, you're gonna have noise, but in terms of being able to deliver an image to a client, you know, I think it works really well. If we do for another image here, you know, to do this, you know, if we just bring up the shadows and bring up the blacks, you can see that, you know, there's detail there. Now, of course, you know, I was shooting this at 1.4, so the background is pretty blurred out. I probably should have shot this a little wider just to be able to see how well it recovered the details there. But, you know, as you can see, if you were underexposing to save those highlights, and if I bring the highlights down a little bit, you know, you can really see that we can get those highlights to be very similar to how they were over here in the underexposed area. it works really, really well. If we go to a landscape shot here, so this one, I can't remember how many shots I did it underexposed, but I mean, as you can see, when you're looking at it here, you're not really seeing much of anything at all. But if we bring this exposure up, say 3 stops, let's bring the shadows up, bring the blacks up, let's bring the highlights down. So you can see here that, you know, the recovery is really well. Now, again, you're going to have noise, okay? So you can't expect to bring the exposure up 3 stops, up your shadows 100%, your blacks 100, and not have noise. You're going to have noise, but I think the detail that it was able to recover, the colors, I think that this is fantastic. I would never push my EOS R to this degree. I think by this point, it would have absolutely fallen apart. You know, and if we come in and maybe add a little bit of clarity, add a little bit of contrast, you can see that, you know, this file over here is still usable. Now, of course, you would not want to routinely underexpose your shots by 3 stops and have to do this type of recovery, but it's good to know that you have this latitude for your shadow recovery. It does perform really well. And again, if I were to say use the EOS R, you know, worse to 5D4, I think this image would have completely fallen apart. So I'm very pleased with the shadow recovery. It's really good. Now, if we come over and we go to the highlight recovery, you know, I don't think it performs quite as well. Now, this isn't as drastic of a scenario, but I want to play around with it. So if we have this one here and we bring the highlights all the way down, you see there's not a lot of movement there in terms of recovery on any of the highlights, just in moving the highlight slider. And then when we move the whites all the way down, we do get some detail back here. So there is a little bit of difference. You know, we get a little bit of recovery up here, but not much at all. So there's just not as much of a drastic difference in terms of the highlight recovery as there is with the shadow. So it's not terrible, but it's not great. If we move to this image here and we do the same thing, you know, when I'm bringing those highlights down, it's obviously not doing a ton. And again, some of this is obviously going to be blown out. So, you know, there's only so much you can recover in highlights if it's blown out. But if I bring the whites all the way down, you can see that there's just not much of a difference. We just don't get that much recovery. If I bring the exposure down a few stops, it really starts to fall apart up here in the highlights, and even here, it's just not pretty. So when it comes to highlight recovery, you know, the R5 it's on par with a lot of Canon cameras, which isn't great. You know, that's just the reality. As a portrait photographer, you know, I always try to get it right in camera. I know that, you know, we have the ability to do these things in post, and that's why we shoot raw, and that's fantastic. But, you know, I think it's important to try to get the exposure as good as you can in camera, and then you can finesse it in post. So for me, I would more so be underexposing shots and bringing those shadows up more so than I would be overexposing and trying to recover those highlights. So for me, the highlight part of it isn't really a problem. I'm more impressed and more excited about the ability to be able to bring up the shadows so that way I can protect the highlights in my photo. That's more exciting and more beneficial to me than the highlight part of it. So I do want to point out that the highlight recovery isn't great, but the shadow recovery is definitely improved over the R or something like a 5D4 or lower. You're definitely going to see some improvement. And although I've never shot Sony, I've definitely watched a ton of videos on dynamic range with Sony. I've looked at Sony images. I know people that shoot Sony. I would definitely say the shadow recovery is on par with Sony. It may not quite be as good. I think Sony sensors are fantastic. So I don't think it's necessarily quite as good. It probably wouldn't perform as well in every situation that a Sony would, but I definitely think Canon took some steps forward in the dynamic range on the shadow side in the R5. It is great. Thumbs up to them for that. ISO performance, you know, I'm really not going to jump into that. I did some comparisons in my comparison video. ISO performance is very good. I don't hesitate to push this camera whatsoever. It performs very well at high ISOs. I will push this thing to 25/600 without even thinking twice about it. And of course, there's going to be noise, yes, but it's noise that you can use. The image doesn't fall apart. It's usable. It still looks good. The color still looks good. There's still some decent amount of sharpness in your photo. It's more than usable. Okay, up next, IBIS. IBIS, it honestly is not something that I've really used much in the past 2 months. I don't shoot video, so I think there's more of a benefit for IBIS in the video world. From a portrait perspective, I've not really been in a situation where I needed to bring that shutter speed down low enough to where I was really testing IBIS. The thing about IBIS from a portrait photographer perspective is, sure, it's great that I can bring the shutter speed down and be able to let more light and get the exposure where I need it to be. But if I'm shooting at 15th of a second or 10th of a second, I'm going to have movement from my subject. So it's still going to be challenging to get tack sharp images. So to me, when I'm shooting at those lower shutter speeds is not more advantageous than me just pushing up the ISO. I would rather push up the ISO and have more noise, but I have a relatively tack sharp image, than to utilize the IBIS and use a lower shutter speed with a lower ISO. But now I have subject blur and subject movement in the shot, so it doesn't appear as sharp. I would rather have a noisier, sharper image than a less noise, blurrier image. So I really haven't used the IBIS that much. It's great that it's there, so that if I do need it, hey, great, I have it. But for the most part, I really don't use it. And if I'm using a lens that doesn't have IS built in, a lot of times I tend to turn IBIS off because it's, I would rather just have it off and not impacting my shots anyway. But I will say that when I have used IBIS, it has been great. But I can't really report much on it because I don't use it that much. So as a portrait photographer, it may not be something that's really all that important to you, but it's great that it's there. Okay, last, overheating. I really haven't done much more testing with the overheating than I did on the last video because I don't see the point. I think the overheating videos, now I don't want to get into it too much, but the overheating videos are in some ways a bit frustrating because people are taking this camera and they're trying to push it to the limits to see how quick they can get it to overheat or what can they do before it overheats. And I've taken a different approach. I've just used the camera the way that I use cameras. And, I have observed to see what happens at that point. Now, again, I don't shoot video, so the overheating was never really a problem for me. But what I can say from the photography side is that there are some people who have been shooting stills and they still get the overheat indicator, because when you shoot stills, it does still give you the timer for how much time you have to record. So if you have your video record setting in one of the 8K or the HQ 4K modes, you will still get the indicator that it's overheating because it's trying to let you know how much video record time you have. I don't keep my camera in those modes really because I don't shoot video, so I really haven't cared, but I have shot with them in those modes and I've never gotten the overheat warning. So my style of shooting, I'm just not overheating the camera. Again, I keep my EVF that I don't really use, but when it is used, it's in the lower frame per second. I keep my LCD off when I'm not using it. I'm not really shooting in burst a lot. I'm not doing a ton of autofocus tracking. So, I'm not really taxing the camera to the point where it would really overheat anyway. So I haven't experienced even the indicator. But from a still photography perspective, the overheating is not something that you have to worry about. When I did my comparison video a couple months ago, I overheat the camera and I was still able to turn it back on and shoot stills no problem. Now, I didn't really dive deep to see what type of impact that would have on the image quality. If I had to guess, I would say there would be some sort of IQ loss, the same way when you do, for example, longer exposures and that sensor really gets hot. It is going to introduce a little bit more digital noise. So I'm sure that would be a thing with this if it were to overheat. But I don't think it would be anything that you have to worry about. Again, if you're looking for a problem, you can find a lot. When you just use the camera the way that you would use a camera and you don't spend time sitting at the computer pixel peeping, these things are really a non-factor. And these are things that your client they're not going to recognize, they're not going to be able to look at it and say, oh, you know, this is a little noisy. Trust me, I've seen terrible images online and people love them. So clients' expectations are very low. So you really don't need to get bogged down with all that stuff. So for me, overheating is a complete non-factor. Haven't had to worry about it. I would recommend this camera to anyone. I love this camera. I enjoy shooting with this camera. It makes it fun to shoot. My sessions with this camera have just been fantastic. The R5 is a great camera, but you know, I just want to set the expectation that although it's a great camera, there will be things about the camera that's not perfect, whether it's from an ergonomic perspective or an autofocus perspective or an overheating perspective. You know, there are going to be things about any camera that aren't going to be perfect, but you really have to learn how to take the imperfections and make it work for your style of shooting. Don't shoot to break the camera, shoot how you shoot and work within the confinements of what the camera can do. And that's what I've done with the R5. I've really had no problems with it whatsoever. I know some people have reported quirky things like it freezing up and that sort of thing. Hopefully I'm not jinxing myself when I say I've never encountered that kind of problem. The camera has just worked. It has been there. It has performed. It has delivered. To me, the R5 is well worth the money. I know people argue that it's overpriced because of the 8K and the overheating and all of that. But if you take into perspective the cost of the 5D4 when it launched, I believe it was either $32.99 or $34.99 when it launched. And when you look at the R5 and you consider that it really is a mirrorless equivalent of a 5D, it really is a photography camera first with video capabilities. When you take that into account, $34.99, $38.99, extra $400 for IBIS and some 8K, 4K video that although you may not be able to use it the way you want, it's there and you can use it. To me, I think this camera is an amazing value for what you get for it. And how well this camera has improved over the autofocus over, say, a 5D4 and you know, the other features that this camera has, to me, I think it's well worth the cost of this. I don't regret this purchase whatsoever. It has been great. And I should add, and I probably should have said this at the beginning of the video, I am in no way sponsored by Canon. I am an avid Canon shooter. I have shot Canon my entire life, so I love Canon, but I bought this camera with my own money, and everything I'm saying has been from my experience. So I'll leave you with that. It is a great camera, but you know, there's no such thing as a perfect camera, and this is no different. So if you are interested in picking up the R5, I think it would be something that you would absolutely love and enjoy. And if not, you could just return it and someone else will buy it and they will love and enjoy it. Do not make a YouTube video saying why you're returning the R5. There's too many of those already. So this video was way longer than I thought it was gonna be, but I just wanted to get all that out. So I know it's been a while since I've done a video. I've just been really busy. So hopefully I can get back to making more videos here soon. So with that being said, we're going to end it there. Hopefully you have been well, stay safe. And until next time, take care. I'm tired of talking. Oh, it's way too long. I'm going to bed.